Would you pray with me? Holy God, may the words that I speak and the thoughts that come to our hearts be good and acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Friends, this morning we're going to talk about the opioid epidemic that is gripping our nation and our county, and proclaim a word of hope to those who are struggling, those who are either caught up in the midst of the disease of addiction themselves, or those who love someone who is struggling with a disease called addiction. Notice that I said the disease called addiction, because although some might call it weakness and others would say that's a choice, we now know that addiction is a disease, a process in the body, and that those who suffer with it deserve our compassion and our kindness rather than our judgment or scorn. And there are many, so many who are suffering. For the last 5 years, our county prosecutor has been working with faith leaders to confront this epidemic in our area. And when this work began 5 years ago, every 19 minutes, someone in the United States was dying of a drug overdose. Now, in 2018, someone dies every 8 minutes. In our county alone, the organization New Jersey Cares estimates that 16 people have died this year. The numbers are staggering. But this is about more than the numbers. Every person who has lost their life to this disease has a story that is all their own. And here's one story that I came across. I shared it on our Facebook page, and you may have seen it in your own feeds. Earlier this month, a young woman around my age, Madeline Linsenmere, lost her life to addiction. She grew up and spent most of her life in Burlington, Vermont, and the addiction that would dominate her adult life began at 16 when, at a party, in a bit of wild experimentation, she took one pill, OxyContin, a pain pill. And from that pill spiraled decades, years of addiction. I'm going to share with you just a little bit of the story that her sister wrote for her. She writes, "It is impossible to capture a person in an obituary, and especially someone whose adult life was so largely defined by drug addiction. To some, Maddie was just a junkie. When they saw her addiction, they stopped seeing her. And what a loss for them. Because Maddie was hilarious and warm and fearless and resilient. She could and would talk to anyone, and when you were in her company, you wanted to stay. In a system that seems to have hardened itself against addicts and is failing them every day, she befriended and delighted cops, social workers, public defenders, and doctors who advocated for her and believed in her till the end. She was adored as a daughter, sister, niece, cousin, friend, and mother, and being loved by Madeline was a constantly astonishing gift. During these last 2 years especially, her disease brought her to places of incredible darkness. And this darkness compounded on itself as each unspeakable thing that happened to her and each horrible thing that she did in the name of her disease exponentially increased her pain and shame. For 12 days this summer, she was home, and for most of that time, she was sober. For those 12 wonderful days, full of swimming and Disney movies and family dinners, we believed, as we always did, that she would overcome her disease and make her life for herself the one that we knew she deserved. We believed this until the moment she took her last breath. But her disease stalked her and stole her once again. Though we would have paid any ransom to have her back, any price in the world, this disease would not let her go until she was gone. just a piece of her story. And Maddie's story is one of thousands. And while today we're focusing our attention on opioid addiction, we know that many more suffer from addiction to alcohol and other substances. And we know how hard it is to speak to the struggle, how hard it is to find the right words to say to someone that we know is struggling, or someone we know that loves someone who is struggling. And I think today our gospel text might give us some clues on things that we can do to help and things that we sometimes do that are less than helpful. As Jesus and his followers leave Jericho, they pass by Bartimaeus, a blind man, a man who has suffered for most of his life with a disease that is not of his own making. And because of this disease, he's been excluded from society. He can't work. He lives on the margins. Literally, he lives on the way out of town. And he has to beg, to plead for the mercy of strangers just to get by. But one day, Bartimaeus hears that Jesus is near. Jesus, the great teacher and healer. And so he calls out to him, "Have mercy on me. Help me, please. I can't carry this anymore. Have mercy on me, Jesus." And he cries from the depths of his being. And when he does, there are so many who try to shut him up. They get in the way of his healing. There were many who told him to be quiet. And the text doesn't tell us why they said that. Maybe they were trying to protect Jesus. After all, he's an important person with important things to do. Maybe they didn't think that the blind man was important enough. Maybe they believed he wasn't worth anyone's time. We don't know. But I see in his story to find healing, a mirror to the struggles that an addict might encounter on his road to recovery. There are many barriers to be overcome for someone who is seeking healing from addiction. Last April, I had the privilege of going to a town hall meeting where people in recovery shared their stories. They talked about how hard it is to get coverage from health insurance to go into a treatment facility. They talked about how there's not enough beds in rehabs for people who want recovery right now. But the greatest struggle that people shared, and I heard it over and over in each story, was that there's still so much stigma around addiction, that people have made them feel disgraced and discounted because of their disease. In the Common English Bible, this passage says that the people scolded Bartimaeus for shouting to Jesus. And it made me wonder, in what way are we, well-meaning people of faith, scolding people for their addictions? Have we ever made someone feel ashamed or disgraced because of their disease by what we've said or by what we've left unsaid? Luckily, on this day, Bartimaeus had the resources, the inner strength to keep on shouting, to keep on working, to find healing even when others told him to be quiet. And so he continues to cry out until Jesus hears him. And then when Jesus does hear him, Jesus stops and stands still and sends his disciples to bring Bartimaeus to him. And when Bartimaeus stands before him, Jesus doesn't assume that he knows what Bartimaeus needs. As soon as he's close enough, Jesus asks Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus doesn't assume he knows what Bartimaeus wants or needs. He trusts Bartimaeus to tell him. And in this twofold movement of Jesus, when he stops because he hears his cry, and when he honestly and openly asks Bartimaeus what it is that he can do for him, I hear words of hope. Words of hope for people who struggle with addictions and destructive behaviors. Words of hope for the family and friends that love him. And words of hope for all of us. Jesus stops as soon as someone calls out for healing, and he listens, even when everyone around him just wants to move on. And I believe there's power in that. Because sometimes, friends, when we are hurting, really deeply hurting, we can arrive at a place where people can't hear us, where people don't want to hear us. In my experience, when you walk the road of recovery or you walk along someone else on the journey, you can arrive at a place where no one wants to hear you anymore, where people just see your addiction, or they just see you as the person who loves someone with an addiction, and they stop seeing you in the fullness of your whole humanity. You can come to a time when people stop asking you how recovery is going, when they stop asking how your son, your daughter, your aunt, your mother, or your grandfather is doing, because they can't handle the pain, and they wish that we would just talk about something else. I know that I've been guilty of that. As someone who deeply loves a family member who struggles with an addiction to alcohol, there are some times that I just don't answer her texts. I don't answer them because I don't know if she's sending them in sincerity or because she's drunk again. And sometimes I don't answer because it just hurts too much. Sometimes we begin to see the addiction more than we see the person. But the good news is, friends, that Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus refuses to do that. I'm pretty sure that it was obvious that Bartimaeus was blind, but Jesus didn't just heal him, he waited. He waited for Bartimaeus to ask for healing. Jesus didn't assume that he knew what Bartimaeus needed. He let him come to him and then asked him what it was that he wanted and needed. Jesus didn't just see the disease of blindness. Jesus saw Bartimaeus, the full person, and treated him like a person of dignity and worth. The good news that I see in this text, not just for those who struggle with addictions, but for all of us who are weighed down heavy by grief and shame and despair so deep that we don't know what to do with it, is that Jesus will never, ever abandon us, never, ever give up on us. Even when everyone else is sick and tired of our stuff, our grief, our dysfunction, our bad habits, our addictions. When people think we're not worth a passing glance, Jesus will always stop and listen. And Jesus is always ready to hear from us what it is we would like him to do for us over and over and over again. Because unlike my love, which unfortunately has its limits, Jesus is the Son of God, the Son of the one who is love, infinite love. In Jesus, we see what infinite love looks like when it's lived out. And infinite love always stops when it hears the cries of our hearts. And sometimes, love is enough to bring healing. On this day, Bartimaeus was healed. But many of us know all too well that not all stories end this way. It's one of the great mysteries and the great tragedies of life, that sometimes our prayers, even the most earnest, deepest prayers of our hearts, aren't answered in the way that we wish they would be. And I can't say why that happens. What I can say with absolute certainty is that Jesus is present in the midst of the pain and suffering, that Jesus is unfailingly present. Love is present always, even in the midst of our anger and grief, In the midst of our frustration, despair, and shame, Jesus is there with us in the darkest valleys, and Jesus will carry us through to the other side. This is a story about a blind man, Bartimaeus, and the healing that he found. But the story belongs to all of us, and we might find ourselves in this story this morning. How are you like the crowd? How do you get in the way of the healing encounter that someone is trying to have? Where are you in danger of seeing the addiction, the disease of addiction, more than you see the person? How are you today, like Bartimaeus? Are you in need of a healing conversation with Jesus? What is it that you want him to do for you? What is it that you need him to do for you? What burden would you like to lay down at his feet? None of us have it all together. We don't. None of us are perfect. None of us love perfectly all of the time. We all have stuff that gets in the way of us being the people that we want to be. And we all at times need healing for something that is more than we can handle on our own. May we never forget that. This morning, may we commit ourselves or recommit ourselves to being people of healing and hope. May we, who know for ourselves just how much we need Jesus, commit ourselves to opening the way for others to experience healing and hope. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.